Now, there's obviously so many parts to this Iran conflict that I want to talk about, and there's someone I wanted to talk to, whose name is Maleki. He is from the Foundation of the Defense of Democracies as a former senior official at the U.S. Treasury Department. He was born and raised in Iran and grew up there. Knew what it was like to live under a regime, comes to America, joins the Air Force, then joins Treasury. He's involved in the sanctions that go against the Iranian regime. If there's anyone to talk to about what's going on, what comes next, and how the US foreign policy under Trump looks different to that of Obama, it's Miad Maleki, joins me now. I just want to start off with your emotions on the day that President Trump announced that there had been strikes on Iran. That must have been a lot for you.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Great to be with you. Um, I was actually talking to a friend about this today. What was interesting was that we kind of knew it was coming. All the signs and indications as far as the military buildup in Persian Gulf and um, the rhetorics that you were hearing from both Iran side and here in the U.S. They were pointing to us getting close to a conflict. Yet, when the President Trump announced the beginning of the campaign, we were kind of surprised. I was personally surprised that it actually like happening. That um, President Trump is coming to the rescue of the Iranians who were just coming out of a major domestic crisis. The regime had killed over 30,000 protesters, and Iranians were disappointed, kind of following the negotiations. I was hearing from friends and family members and relatives, some inside Iran, and they were disappointed to see that President Trump initially said, we're coming to rescue, when the regime was killing um, people who were on the street protesting this regime, to the point that they started seeing negotiations happening with the representatives of this regime. So when President Trump announced the beginning of the campaign, the messages that I was getting from inside the country and I was hearing were, I wouldn't say were surprising, but they were um, very directly in support of, or folks were really hopeful that the strikes are going to really weaken this regime and create some kind of environment where the Iranians can actually go back on the street and demand what they were demanding, as far as change in the regime, change in policies, in without being killed. Um, so that's really, when it was announced, I was kind of surprised to see that it actually happened, but at the same time, hopeful that it would take this regime out.
Yeah, so we all saw the buildup that was coming in Iran and the areas around it from the US, and we thought that something might happen. But yeah, the strikes do take you by surprise because the threat that Iran poses is a threat that has posed since 1979, since the revolution. And there's been so many US presidents that have had the opportunity to really do something about it. And Donald Trump seems to be the first one that's actually done. Would any other US president, if given the same opportunity that Trump has had here, would they have taken it?
That's what I actually said in my piece. Since 1979, um, every US president um, sat across the table from the Iranian regime representatives and negotiated over whether it was their nuclear program, or back in President Bush's time, it was about some regional cooperation that they were hoping to get out from the Iranians in connection with the campaign in Afghanistan. So President Trump really was the first U.S. president that um, just didn't allow the regime to play with him with negotiations that they're really good at, to drag their feet, to keep US government officials and Western politicians um, kind of playing around with them. With talks and negotiations, I think President Trump just wouldn't take it, and really goes back to the fact that President Trump had some direct experience with the Iranian regime during his first term. Other presidents in the U.S., they tend to really um, view Iran's threat as um, a threat that would drag the U.S. into an Iraq type war or Afghanistan type war. And I think President Trump tested the Iranian regime over and over. He took out the closest RGC commander to the supreme leader, RGC Quds Force commander Soleimani, and in 2020. And then he witnessed that what he was told probably by the bureaucracy in the U.S. government, that if you do move forward with such action and take him out, it'll end up turning out into a war for us. And he saw that wasn't really what happened. As a matter of fact, he probably witnessed how after President Biden came to the office, just a year after the Soleimani's assassination, Iranians were willing to come to Vienna, sit across the table from um, directly or indirectly with U.S. government officials and negotiate a deal. And so I think President Trump really understood that this is a paper tiger, and he just realized that the fact that you can get a deal with the Iranian regime and it would be a good deal for from a U.S. national security perspective.
I want to come back to the paper tiger thing, but when you were writing in the New York Post about your feelings about the Iranian strikes, you were talking about how you grew up in Iran. You were there in school when the teachings of the Ayatollahs were coming in and taking root. Could you explain what was school like? What was the childhood like? What was living under that regime like?
Well, I mean, it's I got to tell you, dark days for the Iranian generations after generations who had to deal with this regime. If you were born in the 80s, I was born in early 80s. I never saw pre 1979 Iran, and what I saw, what I witnessed, and what I experienced was um, extremely bad economic situation. I have these memories as a small child, standing in line at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. to get a bottle of milk. Um, there was an Iran-Iraq war going on. After the war, the economy was still extremely mismanaged and in a very bad shape for years, and it still is. Socially, they were imposing very strict version of Islam. The social restrictions were didn't really match the families, the way that ordinary Iranian families were practicing at home. So it was almost living a dual life. At home, you were for most Iranians, even if they were religious, there was some level of moderation. And tolerance. And then you leave your house and you go to school and you go outside and you have to hide what you have at home, whether it's the fact that you're still watching movies that are coming from the West, or movies that belong to Iran by pre-revolution. You're listening to songs that are coming from California, or listening to Bon Jovi and Guns N' Roses, and you go to school and you have to hide that. Um, so it's a really socially, economically, very unstable, and politically, you also don't have really as much stability. So it's really growing up in Iran. We our joy and the good memories that I have, the really things that we had at home, whether it was watching Western movies and secretly passing around VHS tapes that were illegal, or albums of Bon Jovi, to my friends and listening to them at home. Um, and we also had from my mom's side, we were from religious minority group, Baha'i faith and Jewish, both sides. And so we also had those restrictions. So it was really a failed state. And if you had older brothers, sisters. If your mom and dad, talk to you about pre-revolution Iran, then you were only hearing good things, that life was easier. Because, they came to the power, they had the war and the economic mismanagements. They're clerics. Ruhollah Khomeini is the first supreme leader. He came into power with a lot of promises of, justice and fairness and social and economic freedom for all. And Iranians quickly realized that these guys, they can't govern. They don't understand economy. They're just bringing in a revolutionary ideology that doesn't really turn into bread and food for Iranians, and has isolated the country, and it's just really not what they thought they would get out of the revolution. Um, anyway, so dark days. There's a lot I can share, but it was really difficult, the 80s and 90s for most Iranians.
Yeah, I can only imagine. You said that you were listening to, the Bon Jovi coming through there was a fair few mentions. So you're listening to Bon Jovi. Are your friends aware that you were listening to Bon Jovi? Are you keeping that a secret from everyone? Or is there some sort of level of, it's a secret for all of us, but we just can't tell any authority figure about it?
That's exactly what it is. That's the best way to put it. It's really, um, I have this memory of, in probably my elementary school, my teacher asked me to sing a song, and I was a kid, so I sang the song that I had learned at home, and it was from a singer in California, an Iranian singer in California. And I got into trouble. My parents got into trouble, but everyone in the classroom really enjoyed listening to me singing that song, right? So it's a secret that everyone knows. Everyone had VHS tape players at home. Later on, they had CD players at home, but you had to hide it. They had people started getting satellite dishes to watch Western shows, and the regime would fly helicopters over the cities and identify buildings that they had satellite dishes on the rooftop, and then they would go house to house and collect those satellite dishes, and sometimes people were taken and would be detained for having these satellite dishes. So it was really it's a police state, and they're really strict when it comes to making sure that people were kind of following the Sharia law, the rule of Islam that they were enforcing.
So this is where I'm so interested, because when Western music, when Western movies and thought started coming to Eastern Europe in the Cold War, I mean, after that, the Soviet Union, they've got about 10 years left before the might of the people just overwhelms that of the authority figures. But the Ayatollah, he's in power for 35 years, and then Khomeini before him for another 10. How was the Iranian, when you've got a population that is quite enlightened, when they're quite progressive, they don't believe exactly what their leaders are telling them to believe, and you've got quite a large population in Iran, what is the level of suppression of those people that the government can stay in charge of so many people that hate them?
That's a really good question. So let me share with you my perspective on that. So one, and things have changed, but here's the thing. 20 years ago, if you talk to the ordinary Iranians, and I remember having this conversation um, in Iran with people in Iran, and if you ask them, well, to what extent are you willing to go on a street and risk your life and risk everything you have for regime change and protest this regime? The answer was, well, what did we get out of 1979 revolution? What are we going to get out of this one? If there is there is a revolution, there's another revolution. So there was a sense of discouragement, or a sense of not interest in risking their lives in the little thing that they've had in life for another regime change. And um, and there's another important factor here that some of us forget about this regime. They came to power out of a revolution. The supreme leader most of the folks in the Iranian regime, the senior officials from the RGC to political institutions of this regime, they are the revolutionaries in 60s and 70s. These are folks who were detained for years during the previous government, pre 1979 Pahlavi era. There were fugitives, there were thugs, there were revolutionaries. They know, they're experts when it comes to revolutions. So for the past 47 years, they did a really good job taking security steps to prevent a revolution, to make sure that if there is a movement being, taking shape, they can stop it, they can avoid it. One experience that I have, we lived as a child, in my early years of my life until elementary school. I lived only a few blocks. We lived in a house only a few blocks from the Evin prison. It's the most notorious prison, probably one of the most notorious prisons in Middle East, and most notorious prison in Iran. We lived only a few blocks from the prison, and first of all, I remember hearing really loud sounds very early in the early morning, and my dad later on told me that those were actually the sound of fire squads, and they were executing people. Um, but but what happened is they moved us all out. They confiscated those houses, and they moved. Um, they confiscated those houses in that neighborhood, and then they started moving in families and people who were aligned with the regime. Uh, and now looking back, I understand what they were doing. They were moving people who were aligned with the regime to the most strategic locations in the country. That was one of the many, many steps that they were taking to make sure that they're avoiding a situation where these strategic locations could be overtaken by protests. Look at their TV channel. In 1979, one thing that really changed things for Pahlavi government and for the revolutionaries to win over the popular support was really when they took over the TV, the state TV, and they started broadcasting um, their version of the events. And they told people, "Hey, Shah is gone. Come to the street. We've taken over." And that really encouraged people to finish up with that revolution and turn it into the end of Pahlavi era. They've invested the past 47 years in propaganda on how they can control the flow of information. Um, and I talked to people inside the country. As of today, I heard that they are more focused on blocking the flow of information to the country. They're jamming satellite. They have cut out the internet. They have moved their own websites to the internet. So you and I, we're going to have a hard time find out what they are messaging to their domestic population. And at the same time, we can't really get in touch with them. So um, it's the flow of information that we really care about. So my point here is um, they have been they created a very resilience kind of government towards a revolution or a movement that can really pose a serious threat to the existence.
Yeah, and yet here we are, and it's so you bring up there that they've put all of this effort into propaganda. They've owned the state TV. They're constantly broadcasting out how good Iran is, how evil the rest of the world is, and that with the other side of things, in 1979 isn't really in living memory for a large percentage of Iran's population right now. They don't know what life was like before then. They can hear things, so there's been so many protest movements that are just like they're in the streets and they get shot and it can never get past that, but they still come back and they protest more even though they know the consequences are coming. So where is this the dream of a better life coming from? Like, is it just consuming Western media secretly as you did as a child? Is there a big movement within Iran that's sort of homegrown? We're telling people how good it was under the Shah. We will get back there. Where is the protest movement coming from?
Yeah, I mean, it's coming from social and economic pressure that Iranians are feeling every day. And 20 years ago, Iranians weren't really willing as much to go on the street. And, I would say the middle class in Iran who were managing day to day lives, and they were um, um, uh, managing, their needs. They wouldn't, if you ask them, you would get some kind of a sense of doubts when it came to, a revolution, because they had a bad experience from the 79 revolution. That has changed. I think Iranians have realized that this is just going to get worse. These guys are not going to be able to turn things around. They realize that this regime is incapable of reforms. I think there were actually maybe a decade that the Iranians were hoping that reforms might bring about some social reforms, social freedom, and potentially some um, foreign policy directions taken by the regime that would decrease the level of isolation that Iranians are facing. None of that happened. They realized that as long as there's a supreme leader, as long as there's an RGC, as long as this regime is Islamic Republic, they're just not going to see reforms that would make things better. I think Iranians were hoping that with reform, things are going to get better for them, and they don't have to risk their lives to see another revolution and the risk of seeing what happens after. I think at this point, Iranians have realized that it's either an Islamic Republic or it's a chance of having a better future.
Yeah, which really brings us to Donald Trump's speech on Saturday. And I want to play a clip, but to set it up, this is such an extraordinary departure from Trump's approach to Venezuela. All right. That's probably it is our most recent example of what Trump's foreign policy is, what his temperature for regime change is. In Venezuela, he got Maduro in the middle of the night. There was this upswell like, hey, okay, we're going to get Venezuela back to a democracy. Who's the opposition leader? Trump waters it down. He says, you know what? I don't reckon she's got the support. Being code for the military is not going to support her. But that is such a different tone to the one he struck on Saturday when he talked about the Iran strikes.
Upon all Iranian patriots who yearn for freedom, to seize this moment, to be brave, be bold, be heroic, and take back your country. America is with you. I made a promise to you, and I fulfilled that promise. The rest will be up to you, but we'll be there to help.
And what makes that so extraordinary to me is that if Trump gets that wrong and people go into the streets to protest, they go into the streets to take the country back, and the military fights back, that is thousands of bodies in the streets from Donald Trump's words. And you'd think like that would be the equivalent of Reagan's tear down this wall moments and they build a second story. Like it would be so humiliating for him. It would completely undo all the legacy in the Middle East he wants. But he must know that. He must think this is the moment. The military might not fight back. What are the chances that Iran can seize the country right now?
Well, I think there was a window that there's a time frame that President Trump actually thought that he can get a deal. They can get an agreement with the Iranians under the pressure that they were under, economically, and the military buildup that President Trump kind of placed around the country. And we have the midterm elections coming up here, and President Trump was hoping that a deal might be more of he can get a better outcome from a deal, and he gave him a really good chance. But I think President Trump knew that it was unlikely to get a deal, but he wanted to give it a shot. And I think that's why he was so ready to go in. And I guess, you follow the news and you realize what happened is what I had experienced during my time in the government. What I always say is the Iranian regime is his own worst enemy. They had chances one after another during the Biden administration to get a deal. They were given great options, yet they just pushed for more, or they just wanted to drag the talks for longer, and they failed. And that backfired, and they ended up not getting anything. And here we are, President Trump in the office, and he's not going to fall for that game. Um, you know, I think President Trump he looked at a range of options. It would have been a deal. He hoped that the Iranian regime would accept would be reasonable and accept the offer that was put before them. The other option would have been go in and take out their capabilities, the military capabilities, the missile system, finish up, the nuclear program, at least delay that program for a long time, and give Iranians a chance to go in and take over the political institutions and bring about a change. And Iran just had some strong round of protest. So if I'm sitting in the White House and I see that Iranians are ready and willing for regime change, but then they're being suppressed and they're being murdered on the streets, and I have U.S. national security interests that are being threatened by this regime, then I would count on the Iranians to go and take the country back if this regime is weakened in a way that it can't suppress the people as much as it has in the past. So I think President Trump just went for that, and I think the Iranians, there's a very good chance that as soon as the strikes are over, you're going to see Iranians seizing the moment and pushing for regime change. And one last thing, I hear from inside the country that the security forces of the Islamic Republic are now more focused on controlling the population, avoiding or preventing or disrupting any protest or uprisings, as opposed to going to the help of people who are being targeted these days, or focusing on reconstruction or working on defensive measures that they need to develop during these strikes. They're more focused on avoiding another round of uprisings because they know it's coming.
Yeah, and that to me speaks to the point you were making earlier about it being a paper tiger, because that's the actions of a paranoid regime, not a powerful one. That's a regime that doesn't have its affairs in order, that knows that they're hanging on by a thread, and they're more interested in self-defense than actually, self-defense against their own people rather than self-defense against themselves. So you brought up that Iran is a paper tiger. When you were with the US Treasury, you were quite influential in designing the sanctions that went against Iran. I just want to know, one of the Donald Trump's central theses for why this action was so necessary was that he did not feel that Iran was never going to get a nuclear weapon, that they were going to stand down on it. Do you echo those thoughts? Was Iran ever going to get to a nuclear position, and were they ever going to abandon those plans?
Here's what I can offer. It's difficult to predict, but you look at the past and policies of this regime, and you can have a good guess. They spent close to at least hundreds of billions of dollars, if not 1 trillion, on the nuclear program. It's only produced less than 1% of electricity for them. It has not turned into any pharmaceutical, meaningful research and development program for them. It's nothing but the tool to blackmail the international community. It's really closely tied to the revolutionary ideology. It doesn't have economic justification. It doesn't have political justification. It's really what it is. It's another revolutionary ambition that they have. So you look at that, then it's unavoidable to be worried about whether this regime would consider quickly moving towards a weaponization of the program. And by the way, this program was a nuclear weapon program, and they had invested time and resource in developing an understanding of how to get to a nuclear weapon. And at the same time, they're developing ballistic missile technology that really is just nothing but it doesn't have a whole lot of justification for them other than capability that they need to deliver nuclear weapons. So all the signs point to this, really reasonable concern that these guys are, they can in any moment make a decision to move towards a nuclear weapon, and it would be very scary for not just for the international community, but for the Iranians themselves. What I kept hearing from Iranians, ordinary Iranians, is that they don't want to turn into a North Korea. That with a nuclear weapon, and they're stuck, fully isolated. Um, and I think President Trump's concerns were very reasonable. That this, a nuclear program that has no justification other than tool for blackmail the international community, and a threshold nuclear weapon program, it's very dangerous to be left in Iran with this regime.
And what's interesting to me is that thought was also available to Obama and his administration, that these people are crazy. They can't be anywhere near a nuclear weapon. They can't be anywhere near something that could possibly one day design a nuclear weapon. And yet they were rolling back sanctions. I know you were working with the Treasury official Treasury at the time on doing these sanctions. What were you must have been absolutely outraged that this is the stance the administration was taking.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, I was a civil servant, and my role was to implement the president's policy objectives in the best way possible. At a personal level, I designed, worked very hard on the maximum pressure campaign. I had a team of professionals who helped us design that campaign and target the regime, and trying to track and freeze the fund that there were the assets and funds that they were stealing from the Iranian people, and trying to invest that in proxies and terrorist organizations, or the corrupt actors that part of this regime, that they were stealing those resources from the Iranians. So we had a really strong pressure campaign in place, and then we had President Biden who came in, and he wanted to take a different approach. And President Biden's approach was to go back to the JCPOA, and one I was asked to help put together sanctions relief incentives for the negotiators at the time to offer to the Iranians in exchange for some restrictions on the nuclear program. And I think folks understood at the time the nature of the regime. I'm not going to say that the Biden administration officials, or prior to that, the Obama administration officials, they were uninformed. They were very informed. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. But the approach was, you can address the nuclear issue, you can kick that can down the road, and then you can deal with other issues that they're causing, such as support to terrorism, the ballistic missile program, and the human rights violations. What was missing is the understanding of, when you're dealing with a centralized theocracy, dictatorship, you can't say, I'm going to address one behavioral issue, and then give you incentives in exchange for you agreeing to some restrictions on that issue, but then we're going to go after other activities you're involved in. And we know that wouldn't work. And as a U.S. government official, as on a personal level, I had concerns about their approach, but my role was to implement and give them the best options, and I did so. My Iranian side, and as being an Iranian American, it was an opportunity for me to go back and look at the JCPOA sanctions relief, the time frame that Iranians had sanctions relief during the JCPOA, because that would have helped me at the time to understand what type of sanctions relief would be attractive to the Iranian government officials who were engaging in negotiations with U.S. government at the time. And what I can tell you, I was not able to find any signs, any indications that the sanctions relief that were given to the Iranian regime during the Obama administration were used or were leveraged to help the Iranian economy and the ordinary Iranians. They were basically just enriching the regime and its mafia and its corrupt actors. So that was another lesson, kind of a eye-opening experience for me. Not eye-opening, but really just understanding how another deal wouldn't really benefit the Iranian people. And I think the Iranian people themselves knew very well, coming out of the JCPOA, out of the nuclear deal, that this regime is not going to cut a deal to help make the economy better for the Iranians. It's really just a regime survival tactic that they were trying to achieve.
There's another part of it for me, which is, all right, so negotiating with China, negotiating with Russia, nuclear or missile loaning places, the difference is that they're not good people, they're bad people, but they are rational people. Like, you can ration that if there is a nuclear war, you are not going to be alive to see the end of it. Your supporters are not going to be alive to see the end of it. So why would you want to do it? And what I think makes the Ayatollah and the IRGC different is that there is an ideology of Mahdism, which is a very hardline interpretation of Islam, which is that there's this hidden imam. It's going to bring about the apocalypse. We need to get there. And to me, how do you negotiate with people that genuinely want to see the end of days? Like, there's going to be a nuclear war, your supporters will die, you will die. And the response is, hey, you promise? That's exactly what we want. Like, this can't be rationed with. You can't you can't deal your way to peace with these people because they're operating on a different game.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that was one of the that was in the center of the concerns that people like myself had with those talks. There are folks who make the argument that the regime is very rational, and that's why they negotiated. That's what they.
مرزدارانی وای وای سمت غرب رو زد سمت جنت آباد رو زد فکر کنم وای 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 مرزدارانیم سمت جنت آباد.
Stay in power, and one very important element of this regime, a really fundamental matter for this regime is the survival. As a matter of fact, I think Supreme Leader Khamenei said in one of his public speeches that the survival of regime is as important as the survival of Islam. So they realized they need that window of relief during the Obama administration, and they managed to get it. With President Biden, they tried to get the same thing, some relief. And every time the rounds of talks, the difference between President Trump and President Biden and President Obama is that the different approach that they took during the negotiations. President Biden and President Obama team, they had this belief that, and you saw publicly, and you looked at the actions that were taken as far as sanctions actions and economic type restrictions or pressure. There was this belief that, we were talking to them, let's decrease the pressure a little bit. Let's show them some incentives that, we're serious about talks. And you saw, the lack of enforcement of sanctions really provided a kind of a lifeline to the regime for a while during the Biden administration. And President Trump took a completely different approach. Look at the last 3 days of negotiations, or prior to that, the last round of negotiations by Mr. Witkoff and Mr. Kushner. There were sanctions going out while they were doing their negotiations to show that we're talking to you, but that doesn't mean you're going to get a relief just because you're talking. And I think Iranians didn't get that message well. The Iranian regime officials really thought they can push for more, as they have in the past, and that's really that's what really brought us to the point of where we are today.
So something we heard from reporting just as we were walking into studio was that the Ayatollah's second son is now the leader of Iran. That's coming out from Iranian opposition media. It's also in Israel as of when I walked in here. Do we know anything about this guy? Is he any different to his father? Is it a sign that the regime wants to just keep going as is? What do we know so far?
He up until a few years ago, he didn't have a public profile. I mean, he still doesn't have really a public profile. He's been really low key. Um, um, we we did end up sanctioning him as a part of during the first Trump administration for his role in the Supreme Leader's office. So he did play a role in Supreme Leader's office in kind of in the background in decision making. And what we've seen recently coming out are some reports of his engagements in financial corrupt type activities. Um, there were some reports that came out from Bloomberg and other sources shedding light on some of the financial activities of Mojtaba Khamenei. Now, um, I think the fact, listen, like post 1979, in the 80s and 90s, one thing that we were told as we were indoctrinated in school, or meaning under the pressure, the indoctrination pressure of the Islamic Republic, a big part of it was demonizing the West and the US and the Israel. The other part of it was amplifying the message of the Islamic Republic and how it replaced a corrupt Pahlavi government. And one important element of that message was that the monarchy would just pass down the power to the next generation of the same family. So it went from Reza Shah to Mohammad Reza Shah, and how Mohammad Reza was not qualified for the job, was incapable of governing, and no government should be run based on father to son power being handed down. And here we go. The Islamic Republic finds itself doing the same thing that for decades was telling its people that was a mispolitical practice. Um, so I think it's the fact that they went with Mojtaba does pose a challenge to the regime. But at this point, this regime is on its way out. I mean, I don't think they even care as much. They know that they can just. I think they're just going to take the risk because they don't have other options at this point.
I want to talk about next steps for Iran. So, in your article for the New York Post, you said this is fantastic by Trump that we're having these strikes, but he needs to do more. What does Trump need to do next?
I think, and quite frankly, that's what I've also heard from folks that I've talked to, and I heard from some of whom are inside the country. Um, I think the hope is that the strikes continue to degrade the Islamic Republic's ability to um, not just pose a threat to its regional actors, to its regional neighbors, and to us, to our bases across the region, and to the U.S. Um, security interests, but also the part of the regime that is involved in oppressing the Iranians, the Basij militia forces, and the RRGC elements that are in the heart of Tehran and big cities, and they're trained and developed just to counter riots and kill people if they're forming protest and a strong demonstrations. So I think if the strikes continue to weaken the regime's security forces and take out the commanders of these forces, you are going to see the mid-level, low-level RGC and police forces realizing that the commanders are gone, the regime officials are not really around to give them orders, and they might just choose to put their weapons down and not kill their fellow Iranians who are asking for what they probably in their hearts also want. An Iran that has a better economy, that offers some social freedom to different part of the country, different religious and ethnical groups. And I think that is going to break the back of this regime.
Well, we hope so. We hope for a peaceful Iran. Miyad Maleki, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope Iran has peace and prosperity.
Thanks for having me.